Hello? It's just not on, is it? The mic does not seem to work. Oh, does it work? Yes? Okay, great. Cool. Hello, everybody. This session is called Social Cognition. There'll be 5 speakers. I'm the first one. I'm Michelle. Yeah, the talks will be 15 minutes long with 5 minutes for questions. And I'll be in charge of keeping time. All right, okay. Hi, I'm Michelle. My talk is called Modeling Food Sharing as Rational Communication About Relationships. And this is work I've done with Ashley Thomas, Satyash Redkani, Josh Tannenbaum, and Rebecca Sachs. Okay, so imagine a girl named Sarah who has a choice between drinking juice from a vendor that's right in front of her or walking around the block to buy a milkshake. Now you see her turn and start walking in the direction of the milkshake vendor. We're now in the world of a classic theory of mind problem understood as inverse planning. From this small action on Sarah's part, just turning and beginning to walk, you as an observer can infer a lot about Sarah, that her goal is to drink the milkshake, that she desires a milkshake right now, and that she prefers a milkshake to juice. In particular, utility is reward minus cost. So if we witness that Sarah incurred a cost, we accept that the reward from getting the milkshake must have been high. But what if instead of walking around the block to buy a milkshake, the milkshake belongs to another girl, Jane, and you see Sarah sip from Jane's milkshake using Jane's own straw? You can still infer a lot about Sarah, that she likes milkshakes, that she wants a milkshake right now, but that story misses a key piece of information that you might infer. From this action, you learn how Sarah feels about Jane, and probably a bit about how Jane feels about Sarah. You learn about their relationship. Okay, so in principle, these ideas could apply to many sorts of social actions, but in the current work, we chose to focus on the food sharing domain to limit the space of inference. So first, we asked, do people have common knowledge about how action comfort depends both on saliva sharing and relationship closeness? Next, after establishing that common knowledge, we asked first whether people infer relationship closeness based on comfort, and a step further, whether people use food sharing to communicate about relationships. We tested our predictions using modeling. Okay, so we'll start with this one. First, we asked, given relationship closeness, how comfortable is saliva sharing? So in experiment 1, participants read stories like these. Imagine 2 people who would describe the relationship as somewhat close. How comfortable do you think those 2 people would be sharing a milkshake by drinking it from a cup with separate straws? Read these stories for 10 different foods for 3 different possible ways of sharing each food. In a separate norming study, we measured the risk that saliva would be exchanged for each of these 30 food action pairs. For example, for milkshake, a low saliva risk way to drink for 2 people to share it would be to each drink out of separate cups. A medium risk way would be to drink from the same cup with separate straws, and a high risk way would be to drink from the same cup with the same straw. So here I'll show you the data from experiment 1, where comfort is plotted as a function of saliva sharing risk for each of 4 different levels of closeness. The x-axis is saliva sharing risk, which varies from 1 to 7, according to the results of the norming study. And the y-axis is comfort from the results of experiment 1. And each dot is going to be one participant's response to one story. So first, if people are extremely close, I should mention, in that example, it said the relationship was somewhat close. There are 4 different levels of closeness we asked about. It was not close, somewhat close, close, and extremely close. So if the people were extremely close, actions with more saliva exchange are only a tiny bit more uncomfortable. If people are close, actions with more saliva exchange are a little bit more uncomfortable. There's an even larger slope for people who are somewhat close. And finally, for people who are not close, high saliva sharing risk actions like sipping a cup using the same straw or alternately licking one lollipop are very uncomfortable compared to low saliva risk actions like cutting a sandwich in half and splitting it. Altogether, this plot shows an interaction effect between saliva sharing risk and closeness in predicting comfort. Okay, so it seems that people have an intuitive theory of how relationship closeness and saliva sharing risk of an action affects the recipient's comfort with that action. And in particular, close relationships mitigate the discomfort of saliva sharing. Okay, so now that we've established people's shared knowledge in the food sharing domain, we can move on to asking about whether and how people expect receivers of food sharing actions to reason about relationship closeness. So first we ask, do people infer relationship closeness based on comfort? So in experiment 2, people read stories like this. Imagine that Sarah is eating out with Jane. On this occasion, Sarah and Jane are sharing a milkshake. Sarah chooses to share the milkshake with Jane by pouring half the milkshake into a separate cup, then drinking from the original cup, then handing Jane the separate cup to drink from. How close does Sarah think the relationship is? And these were the same food action pairs from experiment 1. If you recall, there were 10 foods, each of which have 3 possible ways of being shared: one low, one medium, and high risk action. So I'll show you the data with saliva sharing risk of the chosen action on the x-axis and the closeness judgment on the y-axis. And each shot represents one food. So first, for low risk actions in blue, such as sharing a milkshake by drinking from 2 separate cups, like in this vignette, we see the closeness judgments for all 10 foods hovering around 2.5 out of 4. Next, for medium risk actions in purple, like sharing a milkshake by drinking from the same cup with separate straws, the closeness judgments are higher at around 3. And finally, for high risk actions in red, such as sharing a milkshake by drinking from the same straw with the same cup with the same straw, the closeness judgments are even higher, hovering at around 3.5. Oops, sorry. So as you can see, participants are inferring steadily higher closeness judgments for actions with higher risk of saliva exchange. Okay, so the question now is, what's a cognitive explanation for this pattern of closeness judgments? So I'm going to show you 2 models that we tested to see which would best explain the data. First, as a control, we had a null model, which does not infer relationship closeness based on the action at all, and instead assumes the relationship closeness given by the empirical prior. Here I'll show the null model predictions. As before, we have the saliva sharing risk of the chosen action on the x-axis and participants' closeness judgments on the y-axis. The judgments are just uniform and just above 2.5, which was the empirically measured prior. And this is not a good fit to the data we saw from the last slide. Okay, so next we tested a model that we'll call the rational choice model, wherein observers reason about a food sharer who chooses an action to maximize comfort. So I'll explain this model step by step. First, imagine you're the food sharer. For each possible action, you know its saliva sharing risk. You also know how close you feel you are to the receiver. Based on these 2 factors, you feel a certain amount of comfort in doing that action, which is what we measured in the interaction data from study 1. And you can generate this comfort level for all possible food sharing actions for the given food that you're trying to share, and choose to share the food via the action that maximizes your comfort. Mathematically, we can model the probability of choosing an action given a certain relationship closeness as the utility from comfort the actor would get by doing that action in the numerator, summed over the utility from comfort of all possible actions. So in other words, the food sharer chooses an action proportionately to its comfort relative to the comfort of the alternatives. Okay, so now imagine you're the receiver. You see an action with the knowledge that it was chosen to maximize comfort, and you can retrace the steps of the food sharer, estimating the action's saliva sharing risk, and then inferring the relationship closeness for which comfort is maximized. And mathematically, we can model the probability of inferring a relationship closeness given a certain action using Bayes' rule, which just multiply the probability distribution over actions by an empirically measured closeness prior, which, if you recall, was what the null model was fully. Okay, so now I'll show you what this rational choice model predicts with the same axes as before. First, for low risk actions in blue, the closeness judgment is just below 2.5. Next, for medium risk actions in purple, the closeness judgments are quite a bit higher. And finally, for high risk actions in red, the closeness judgments are even higher. This might look familiar. Here's the data from experiment 2 again, side by side with the model predictions from both models. And you can see that the rational choice model fits the pattern of data quite nicely. This tells us that people can use inverse planning to infer relationships from a social action the same way they can use it to infer goals, desires, and beliefs from a physical action. Okay, so do people infer relationship closeness based on comfort? Yes, using inverse planning. And we've now learned something interesting about social actions that depend on relationships, which is that the recipient can interpret an action as evidence of relationship closeness. And for somebody who is confident about this, then these social actions grant an opportunity to not only inadvertently signal, but actively communicate about relationship closeness. So next we ask, do people use food sharing to communicate about relationships? Okay, so to get at this question, we built on the inverse planning vignettes from experiment 2 in several ways which we thought would emphasize the communicative value of the food sharers action. So as before, the vignette starts, like, imagine that Sarah is out eating with Jane. But next, in bold, it specifies that Jane is not sure how close Sarah thinks they are. And then it lists 2 action choices that Sarah specifically considers. Here it's listed as action or alternative action. And then finally, it says that Sarah chooses to share via one of those options. And asks again, how close does Sarah think the relationship is? Okay, so I'll show you the data. The axes and color coding are the same as before. But here the data points are also shape coded according to whether the saliva sharing risk of the specific alternative action was higher or lower than the action choice. So here are the low risk actions in blue. Here are the medium risk actions in purple. The purple triangles represent when the alternative was high risk. And the purple circles represent when the alternative was lower risk. As you can see, the purple circles are generally above the purple triangles, meaning that participants infer higher closeness when the alternative was low risk compared to when the alternative was high risk. And finally, here are the high risk actions in red. So as you can see by the pattern of the data as a whole, participants are inferring higher closeness for actions with higher saliva sharing risk. And in particular, for medium saliva risk actions, participants are inferring higher closeness when the character is foregoing a more comfortable action. So it's using the information from the alternative. Okay, so in addition to comparing the null and rational choice model predictions to this data, we also created a new model, which I'll call the communicative model, and I'll explain it here. In this model, observers reason about an actor who attempts to maximize comfort while communicating about her relationship. So the food sharer's thought process looks a lot like before, as in the rational choice model. As a food sharer, you want to do a comfortable action where comfort is given by saliva sharing risk and relationship closeness. However, this time you also want to communicate to the receiver how close you think the two of them are. Mathematically, we model the probability of choosing an action given a certain relationship closeness as the joint utility from comfort and the communicative goal summed over the joint utility of all possible actions. This is really similar to the rational choice model, just added the utility term of communication. Okay. As before, the comfort utility terms are given by the study 1 comfort data. But crucially, to get at the utility of communication, we need to calculate what a rational choice observer would infer. But luckily, we already have that calculation. It's the receiver term of our rational choice model. So this is the equation for utility of communication. This R naught variable is simply the rational choice model receiver. So you just plug that in. If you're familiar with the rational speech act models of communication, this embedded calculation is analogous to models of pragmatic speakers reasoning about literal listeners. Okay, so overall, and just like the rational choice receiver, the communicative receiver can retrace the steps of the food sharer in order to infer relationship closeness. However, this time, the probability of inferring a certain closeness is proportional to the communicative actor's distribution over actions, rather than the rational choice actors. Okay, so now I'll show you the communicative model predictions with the same axes as before. We have the low risk actions in blue, the medium risk actions in purple, and the high risk actions in red. So this might look familiar, which is good. Here we're going to plot the predictions of all 3 models, the null, rational choice, and communicative model next to the data. So here's the data, which I've already shown you. Here are the null model predictions, which are uniform. Here are the rational choice model predictions. And finally, here are the communicative model predictions. So a couple of things to note here. First, compared to the rational choice model predictions, the communicative model exaggerates low inferences lower and high inferences higher. And this is a function of its utility on communication. Second, in the communicative model predictions, we see this separation in the medium risk actions in purple, depending on whether the alternative action was lower or higher risk, just like I explained in the data. And we don't see this pattern in the rational choice model. Intuitively, this is because the rational choice model simply judges closest based on the comfort of the chosen action, and it doesn't take the alternative action into account. However, the communicative model considers what the receiver's closest inference is in order to successfully communicate, and that depends on the alternative action. So the communicative model is the best fit model to this data. From this, we learned that when a scenario has communicative salience, people choose actions in part to cause desired inferences about closeness. Okay. So to summarize, first we asked whether people have common knowledge about how action comfort depends on both saliva sharing and relationship closeness. And the answer was, yes, they do. Specifically, people think close relationships mitigate the discomfort of saliva sharing. Next, we asked whether people infer relationship closeness based on comfort. And the answer was yes, using inverse planning. And finally, we asked, do people use food sharing to communicate about relationships? And the answer here is yes. Specifically, when an action has communicative salience, people choose actions to cause desired inferences about closeness, in addition to optimizing for comfort. So this brings us mostly to the end of my talk, but I'll just say one last thing. We're all here in Toronto this year for CogSci, and it feels particularly appropriate to be talking about communication via food sharing, because the land where Toronto sits is actually covered by a treaty called the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, signed in 1701 between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The dish represents the land Toronto that was to be shared peacefully, and the spoon represents the sharing of the land in a spirit of mutual cooperation. This is consistent with my research, as the treaty's name implies a commitment not just to distributive justice, but to the relationships we have with one another. Okay, that's all. Thank you. Yeah, we have 5 minutes for questions. So timer. Yeah.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
What?
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Oh.
Sorry, are we taking the online questions now?
Sorry, I'm trying to
Okay.
do you think this ever happens in real life? It seems implausible to me that I would do this as a way to communicate relationship closeness as opposed to just as a function of it. Like that communicative goal seems a little odd to me. Is there any data? Do you have any anecdotal evidence, etc.?
I mean, I don't have specific like data from the real world that this happens, but I do feel like it happens. I think like once, I don't know, according to the same like logic by which I presented my data, I feel like once you realize like as the receiver that somebody is like doing something, it could be like this food sharing type thing or just any kind of like social action that might implicitly like mean something about how comfortable they are with you. Like you learn some information about that, right? And then once you realize that it's possible to learn information, you can just flip it around and be the actor on that end and do it with you. I feel like this, I mean, maybe it's because I'm doing this research, but now everything, whenever I eat food, maybe it's just me, but at least one person is doing this. Okay. Yeah. Oh, maybe we should have I don't know how the online questions work. Sure.
So are we taking online questions?
Okay, let's do one online question.
All right. There's one question. Ham Huang asked, how did you estimate the utility for different actions, different degrees of saliva exchange in the rational choice model?
How do I estimate the utility for different degrees of saliva exchange? Well, we had comfort. So the first plot I showed you was a plot of people's like judgments of comfort based on different levels of saliva exchange. The levels of saliva exchange we like measured for different foods in a norming study. And then in experiment 1, we had people rate how comfortable each of those actions were. And that's for the rational choice model, the utility of comfort is just like a linear function of that comfort that we measured. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. And then, yeah, an in-person question.
So I know there's like good independent reasons to be studying saliva sharing, specifically for like the developmental importance of that cue. But in this study, I was wondering how general you think the phenomenon of kind of like comfort is, and whether it would generalize beyond saliva sharing to like other things that are uncomfortable to do with someone, and or whether there's sort of like latent properties that are specific to saliva sharing that make it like a particularly like useful case of this kind of thing.
Yeah, good question. I think I came into this research being interested in this like at a much more general level. Like I wasn't interested specifically in saliva sharing. I ended up studying it in the domain of food sharing because like saliva sharing is a good like cue that we know about, that we know signals like closeness, or we know like, you know, people who share saliva are close, like infants think so, kids think so, adults think so. So it seemed like a good place to start. But I would love to expand this to like many other sorts of actions. Like maybe like, I don't know, I was thinking about it as like, yeah, we could just say, like, I could tell you, hi, I think we are somewhat close. But like people don't do that for many, I mean, whatever, a better wording of that, but people don't do that. It's uncomfortable, it's awkward. Yeah, it's like there's no plausible deniability. I kind of came into it thinking like, what actions would have plausible deniability? Like maybe I'm just the kind of person who like just loves to share milkshakes with everybody. It doesn't mean anything. So like you could infer whatever you want, but I have plausible deniability. And I think there's so many actions in the world that have that property. Yeah. Yeah, in the back. Unless there's an online question, sorry. Okay. This is the last question. I think we are almost at 5 minutes.
Hello, this is
Hi.
really close. But just, yeah, really cool kind of design and a really neat way to study this kind of things. Just a general thought that I had when listening to this, and I don't know whether you've done this or maybe you have plans for this in the future, but I was thinking of a scenario, you know, where you as an agent kind of have an idea about your relationship with the person, and you go up to them and you say, oh, could I share, you know, could I have a taste of your milkshake? And you assume that they're just going to kind of like hand you the straw and you take a sip, but then they sort of like grab another cup and pour it in. I wonder if you have any plans to look at maybe how, you know, or any kind of models that would show how do we learn or update our beliefs about, you know, our relationship with another person based on then how your kind of expectations are violated in this sort of context.
Yeah, I'm actually really interested in that. That might be what I want to do next with this. And also just like this other concept of like, how do I change? Like if I think I know what a relationship is like what if I want to like bring it a step further, become a little closer? Like what do I can do an action that might be like a little bit strange given the history of our relationship, right? And then how would the other person react? How would that, and I think like emotions are very involved in that. Like I think if I were to model like that kind of back and forth like thing, I might need to include like some emotions in my modeling, like disappointment or things like that. Yeah, but I'm very interested in that.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody.